from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We are pleased to bring you the last program in our series that's been running called Journey Through Time. And for you viewers who've been watching over a number of weeks, we have had the delightful opportunity to take you to Beijing, to Alexandria, to Athens, to Paris, and New York City. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been dealing with humor versus humorless approach to life. And as you know, in those programs, we had a wonderful time with some very, very well-known literary people that were very, very funny. On today's program, we're going to continue and close out with this question, and we're having conversations with famous residents and visitors to New York City. And I welcome to the program 3 guests for this final program in this series of Journey Through Time. I welcome Dorinda Moyer, who is on the staff at North Idaho College, and she's here today to portray Fanny Brice. And Miss Brice lived from 1891 to 1951. She was an American comedian and singer, and also was involved with the Ziegfeld Follies. Miss Brice, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, kid. Nice to be here. Nice to be here.
And I'm equally pleased to welcome to our program from the faculty of North Idaho College, Annie McKinley, who is portraying Mae West. And Miss West was, as you know, an American actress, and she lived from 1893 to 1980. Miss West, it's a pleasure to meet you and to have you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be had. Thank you, Derry.
And our third guest today is Sabrina Hammonds, who is a student at North Idaho College, and she is here to portray Mary Todd Lincoln. And Miss Lincoln lived from 1818 to 1882 and was the First Lady of America from 1861 to 1865, was the spouse of Abraham Lincoln, who is probably the most admired president in our history. Miss Lincoln, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Mr. Stewart. You have just been a wonderful host. And as you know, I too take great pride in being a wonderful hostess. So I've really appreciated your consideration.
Well, your charm is greatly appreciated. We'll start our program, and I would like to start with Miss Fanny Brice. Tell us a little bit about your life and share with us what it was like to be, in your time, a comedian and a singer, and the enjoyment. I'm sure that New York City is an area that would be a delightful place to be for someone in your field and occupation.
Indeed it was, Tony, because there were so many stages in New York. And as long as I was on the stage, I was a happy person. I loved to make them laugh. In fact, I started when I was a kid. We used to go down to the amateur night down at Keeney's Theater. Just kind of snuck in one night. Well, I'm standing there in the wings, right next to Frank Keeney himself. All of a sudden, poof, he's giving the hook to the guy on the stage, and he throws me out on the stage. So I get up there, and out comes this music, and I start singing, been singing and entertaining them ever since. In fact, as soon as that spotlight came on me, I knew I had it. It was a great life, Tony. You would have loved it. You would have loved it, kid.
Well, I'm not so far removed that I cannot observe some of the history of when you performed. Tell us a little about the Ziegfeld Follies and some of the things that you did.
Oh, Ziggy. He was a man. What suave he had. Did you know him, May?
Intimately.
Of course. May knew everyone intimately. Well, anyway, Ziggy was my man. He took me to the top. If it hadn't been for him, I would have been good, mind you, just not as well known, perhaps. We did elaborate costumes, elaborate sets. I was a star, you knew, of course. W.C. Fields, Will Clark, all the big ones, they were there. When I first went on, I called up Irving Berlin. And yes, I did know Irving Berlin. He was a good friend.
You knew lots of famous people. Your circle was exciting.
Well, it was indeed. You know, there was never a dull moment. I loved people who needed people. That was me. Some referred to me as Funny Girl. I liked that name. I liked to make them laugh. If you could make people laugh, took you away from the times. You know, the stock market, they said that was crashing. They said that people were unemployed, but, you know, I really didn't care about that stuff. I stayed on stage. I made them laugh. So Ziggy, back to Ziggy you asked me about, he just took me right up to the top and then stayed there for, let's see, the Follies of 1907, 1906. Time does pass, doesn't it, honey? Well, they were pretty good ones. And then the Follies of 34 and 37. I had 7 pet numbers during those shows. It was a grand time, Tony.
You performed at packed
time.
houses?
Oh, packed house, honey. They called me out at least 6 encores after everyone. 7 sometimes. Yes,
Yeah.
I was good.
And had a great life.
I did have a great life. You know, I had my kids. I had a few husbands. Let's see. 3 husbands, actually. There was Frank the barber. Married him because he smelled good. And then there was Nicky. Married him because he looked good. Woo. And then I married Billy Rose, of course, because he thought real good, Billy. He made a star out of me, too. Did a lot of my numbers for me. It was good times back then, Tony, good times.
Well, thank you so much. We'll be back to talk to you some more.
Oh, I sure hope so.
Well, Mae West, welcome to the program again. And you, like Fanny Brice, you certainly had a great life and a lot of fun and were well known. And tell us a little bit about how you came to stardom and some of the things that you did.
I will, Mr. Stewart. I was born in Brooklyn, like Miss Brice here, and my mother Tilly was the driving force behind my career. I entered the stage, the first stage appearance was when I was 7 years old. And I went on to star in many plays, and I was in the Follies, and I was in the burlesque. They say I was in burlesque a little bit, but I went on to, some people know me as probably a stage play performer. Some people know me as in my movies, but I'd also like to be known for my writing ability. I wrote 11 plays, about 4 books, and I rewrote most of my movie scripts. And I think that's not bad, as I only had a 3rd grade education. But you understand, I do speak 2 languages, English and body. So I am a bilingual. Yes, there was a very exciting time in New York. There was a lot going on. They didn't really know what was going on with the war and women being a little bit liberated with the men going off to war, and things were very exciting at that time.
But you are best known for your movies by the general population, both in your time and for those who have come since then. Of course, those movies are still available and one can view them and enjoy them. How many movies did you make?
I made 12 movies. My first movie was done in 1932, and they claim I was 40 years old at the time, so I started my movie career when I was 40. And I made 12 movies. The last 2 movies, the critics say were a little bit, how did they describe me? As a sex queen gone to seed, is what the critics say. But the critics can be cruel, can't they?
They can be cruel.
They can be very cruel. And so, but I made 10. 2 of them were before the censors, and 2 of them were released in 34 and 32, and then put away until the 1960s and re-released. At one time, I believe in 1934, I was the highest paid woman in America.
Also, prior to making the movies, as you indicated, you were not making movies at young ages is true today, but what preparations did you have that made you a success in the movies? What did you do before making the movies starting at age 40? Did you do stage?
I did stage, and I was in my first play was one I also wrote called Sex. Can we say that on the air here?
Oh, you can say that in 1998.
Oh, okay. So,
Times are somewhat
when
different.
Sex was first released, there were certain papers in New York that could not print the name of the play that was playing, and they had to say, the play at a certain theater. They couldn't say Sex because you couldn't write Sex in the paper at that time. So, and then I went on to produce the movie The Drag, or The Pleasure Man, and then The Drag. Those were both closed down very quickly because they dealt with homosexuality, and even though New York was a little bit racy at the time, they weren't ready for that yet.
And yet, both you and Fanny Brice would indicate that living in New York in your time was probably the most liberal place in America, and yet there were restrictions there compared with the time when we were interviewing you in 1998. But is that one reason why you enjoyed New York? There was more room and freedom for artists than
Who's that wonderful mayor we had? Mr. Walker, was it?
Could have been.
Mr. Walker enjoyed the theater. He enjoyed the theater, and he enjoyed kind of playing around. And what we really had the trouble with was when, I believe Mr. Walker went off to Europe and left someone in charge of New York City, and that's when I was put in jail at that time.
And we're going to come back to that and talk to you about your views on censorship. But I do want to have some time with our third guest, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was the First Lady of the country, as I indicated in the introduction of the program, from 1861 to 1865. Ms. Lincoln, would you share with us how you got to the point of marrying Abraham Lincoln and some of the duties and responsibilities that you had? I know that you're a much more reserved person than our other guests, and your life has not been as, one might say, joyful as our actresses that we have with us.
Well, Mr. Stewart, I always knew I would marry a president. And I always knew that I would marry for nothing other than love. And although I had schooling in conversation and writing, and I was a wonderful dancer, many of the young men loved to dance to me they were a bore because I sought out intellectual stimulation. So most of the time, while I was at parties, I would dance with the younger men and speak with the older men about politics and that of the such. The reason I was attracted to Mr. Lincoln certainly was not because of his dancing ability with his tall, gangly figure.
That wasn't one of his.
He was a, excuse me for saying this, because I do love my dearly beloved dead husband. He was a horrible dancer. So, anyways, we met at a dance, and he came up and said he would like to dance with me, and we danced, and it was not one of the best times of my life.
Was that in Illinois?
No, this was in Kentucky.
Oh, in Kentucky, before I went to Illinois.
Yes. And he brought up we got to talking, and I asked him over to my sister's house. I was staying with my sister, Miss Elizabeth Edwards at the time, and he would come over and we would read poetry, and basically our love stemmed more from an intellectual basis than it did from an attraction, and it grew from there, and eventually we got married.
He was a very, very wise man and well-read, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, and that was one of the things I admired about him was his intellectual being, and he was one of the most honest and sincere men that I had ever met. And I knew that he had the material to become a president one day, and I knew that with my help, he would get there.
So you had many hours of discussion on a lot of intellectual topics and policies and where you go, but you were very, very driven, I understand, and helpful to his career. And he, too, was very interested in politics. And he had some unsuccessful runs, such as for the U.S. Senate from Illinois. Tell us a little more about how you did help and how you were a partnership.
Well, I always thought of myself so much more as being just his wife or a hostess or a mother. I always thought of myself as an advisor or a critic. I mean, I give my husband all the credit in the world for who he was and what he did. But when he came home and had problems, we always discussed them and discussed what his next move would be. And I feel like he was so honest and sincere that he had a difficult time seeing his enemies and seeing people that would work for him that would not be to his best. So I tried to help him in seeking out his cabinet members and different people that he would appoint, because his nature was so friendly. I just didn't feel like he could see through
you were
some
real.
people.
You were a shield for him, a protection in many ways.
I feel like I was.
Did you have?
But he did have the final say.
Yes.
Always.
But you might be much more perceptive of the personalities of people, where he was more.
Yes, I feel like I was, and I never forgot anything anybody ever did to him or myself. And he was much more forgiving than I was.
Yes, you were a very, very serious person at all times. Let me talk to our two people who are in another time, later time than you, Miss Lincoln, and you can see they have a very different lifestyle. And I hope you don't feel too uncomfortable being here with them.
No, I'm always a lady at first, and so yes, I can conduct myself in the proper manner.
Well, I thank you very much.
I'm a lady. Are you a lady?
I'm always a lady at first.
I'm always a lady.
It's exciting for me to be able to bring these two times together on this program, and generation differences and also lifestyle differences. Miss Bryce, let's go back to you. And one of the things you are known for is your humor. And since we've been enjoying that in this series, and certainly the week at North Idaho College that the program has gone on, why don't you share with us, I guess I would have a two-part question is, why is humor so good for us and so healthy? And then give us an illustration of your humor that you used with your audience, or your technique, or how you got their attention.
Sure, kid. Well, humor in itself, like I said before, the whole era of our time, when the stock market was falling, there was rumblings over in Germany. The world outside the theater was not a happy place right then.
It was unpleasant.
It was a very unpleasant place. And vaudeville was still going, and people would come on into vaudeville shows. They wanted to see and be reminded of a simpler time. And that's what I was there for. They paid me money to come out and help them forget the outside world.
But weren't you very lucky, because performing all the time, lived in your own world. You were able to escape lots of the unpleasantness.
Actually, sir, I don't really remember much of what happened outside the world. I surrounded myself with my friends, with my laughter, with my art, with my horses, my daughter Franz, and that was my life. And you're right, I really did not come out from it. And I figured when people came in, they wanted to enter my world. I didn't need to go out and enter their world. And as far as my humor goes, well, I learned at a very early age, back when I was on the amateur hour, physical humor works. You know, you give a little scratch at this place, or you kind of give it that, or you kind of, well, anyway, you know what I mean. It brings a laugh. What can I say?
So a lot of nonverbal was used?
A lot of
body
nonverbal,
language?
kid.
As
Lot
Miss
of
West says that she speaks 2 languages.
I've got my languages too, kid. And then, of course, there was Sadie, married lady. The Jews were really someone that we kind of mocked, but that was fine then, because I was one of them. Now, I would never, never, never make fun of anyone or any race, anything, except of who I was. I could poke fun at me, and the audience would accept that because I was laughing at me. And so that was fine. So Sadie, married lady, we did just grand together. Blanche Merrill wrote a lot of songs for me regarding Sadie. And then, of course, I always tried to find someone who was in the spotlight and then sort of make a little parody of them. Yes.
So.
And that seemed to work pretty well, too. That was kind of my style, Tony. It was always be me, though, whether you're on stage or off stage, because if you ever forgot, if you were posing, and if you forgot that pose, where would you be? So I was always myself, on stage, off stage.
Well, I believe you also had some conflict with another famous actress, and at some point in your career, did you?
Conflict? In my life? Let's see, Nikki and Billy and Frank. No, I don't think so.
Well, I heard a report. Maybe we can talk about this later.
Maybe in Variety. You know that Variety magazine. You can't believe everything you read in Variety. No. No.
Just do anything to sell.
That's true. Listen to her.
Well, Miss West, you talked to me to go about some of your movies were very controversial. Some of your writings were controversial, and you indicated that there was, even in New York, censorship, and you were even arrested once. So would you share with us your views of, in the context of the Constitution and free expression, and it's obviously clear that you were opposed to having your work censored, and obviously you were unhappy about being arrested. Give us your views.
First of all, I want to correct you. I wasn't unhappy about being arrested. I was arrested, and all the other people in the play were arrested that night. And we went to the jail, but I, of course, arrived in style in a white limousine with a dozen white roses to serve my sentence when I was actually sentenced. And I served 6 days in the jail. But what happened is the first day that I was in there, what they want people in jail to do, the women, they want them to scrub floors and wash clothes. And I've never done any of that, so I was totally useless at that. But I find out that the warden has a crush on me. So I was immediately moved to the warden's home, and I spent time with him and his very dear family. But what I found was, too, from being in the prison and talking to the inmates, I learned so much about more of the commoners and the common life, and I was able to write a play using the different characters that I was exposed to in the prison. And so that was really very good, I think, at that time, to learn that. Also, as you probably know from in the 90s that you're in today, that if some censor starts to go after a movie, everybody wants to see it. So when they censored sex and then sex was reopened, it was sold out for months because everybody wanted to see what they shouldn't be seeing.
So you advocate someone trying to censor it so it could help promote...
Well, it worked to our advantage in some cases. In some cases, we put together, like The Pleasure Man was put together, we produced it, we got it ready to go, and the censors wouldn't let it go on stage at all. Censors were very prudish. But I learned to work with the censors, just like I learned to work with audiences, like Fanny worked with audiences. You learn to work with the censors. So you give them the script, say it be a movie, be play. You give them the script, and then you put in some jokes that you know are really horrendous and really awful, and you might faint at dear. But you put those in, and that's the ones that they cut. But you leave in the ones you really want, so they concentrated on those others. Or I would give them a script, and I would know that just by a little twitch, a little that, you could make it a little bit on the maybe raunchier side. I won't say raunch, raunch is an awful word. But I really believe it's hard to be funny if you have to be clean.
And since you corrected me and said that you really weren't sad about being arrested, because it's a very short sentence, 6 days, sound like you had it pretty good during that time. You were making a political...
It was presentary.
Well, but you were making a political statement. You feel that you were making a statement that would affect the future? You and the others that were arrested?
The what now?
By being censored and then being arrested, that you actually made a political statement?
I did, because I stood up for freedom of speech. That I went with the cast. I was arrested with the cast. I paid all of their legal fees. I paid for everyone to be bailed out, and I totally supported them because I really believed in what we were doing.
Back to you, Ms. Lincoln. You've heard some of these other comments, and we'll come to a much more serious side of you. In your life, there was a lot of tragedy with your children, and of course, what happened to your husband in the end. Would you be willing to share with us a little bit about the sadness in your life? You were depressed a lot, and how did you cope with that, and how did you help the president through the tragedy of the losses prior to his death?
I really did have a very sad and awful life. It began when my second son died when he was 4 years old, and I did mourn him like all mothers would, but at that time you kind of had to accept that because many children died at a young age, and it was kind of a part of growing up. Then as we moved on to the White House, our third son also died at the age of 12. And it was a very difficult time for me because he grew sick on the night of a very important party for my husband and I. And we had consulted the physician, and he said that he would be fine. So we had gone ahead to the party. What people did not know was that myself and Mr. President both went in and checked on him several times. And when he passed away 2 weeks later, several of my critics and other mothers criticized me terribly for not being there with my son that night. And I mourned and mourned and mourned the death of him. And it was many months before I could even be protective to my husband again. And so the thing that kept me going was really my husband. His success meant everything to me in the world. And the other thing that kept me going was my children. I still had my son Robert, and I also had my son Tad, and they were the center of my world. My husband was a very understanding man, and he seemed to be the only person that understood me. And because of his gentleness and his understanding, I was able we kind of leaned on each other. He helped me out and I helped him out. And something too that people may not have been aware of is I suffered from terrible migraine headaches. It seemed like if somebody was not dying, I had one of these awful headaches. So I was continuously going to spas and traveling around trying to find some kind of relief for my medical problems. The other distress I had a lot in my life were the critics. I grew up in Kentucky and then moved on to Springfield, so I was originally from the South and raised in the Southern ways, and I was very loyal to my family. But when I moved into the White House and the war started, I was very, very loyal to the Northern cause. But people did not believe that, so I was criticized by the South for betraying them, and I was criticized by the North because they believed that I was friendly to the South. So if somebody was not passing away that I was close to, it seemed like I was being criticized as a mother, as the president's wife, or for my loyalty. And I will contend to this day that I was very loyal to my husband and I was very loyal to the Northern cause.
Along that line, there's a number of first ladies throughout history that have been non-controversial in the background, and others have been criticized as you, and so I'm sure that the different first ladies have looked at your life to help them in that process. We're getting short on time, but give me a little bit of a view about how, in advising your husband, you did know, how you dealt with the issue of slavery in the Civil War, because it's the most difficult time to be president because there was war among our own people.
Well, actually, my husband had never even been exposed to slavery until him and I met. And after we were married, we went to visit my father, who lived in Kentucky. And the town that we lived in was very major for slave traffic, and it was the first time my husband saw the slave traffic. He saw the whipping block, and my grandmother's home was right outside of where they held the slaves that had run away, and he heard the cries and the screams as they were being beaten. And so if it were not for me, I do not believe that my husband would have been exposed to this and would have felt the way that he did about it. And actually, once we got into the White House, I actually felt stronger about this issue than he did, so I tried to be as supportive as possible about this issue.
Thank you very much. On behalf of our staff, I would like to thank Fanny Bryce, Mae West, and Mary Todd Lincoln for being with us to close out our series that is entitled Journey Through Time. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this series. It's been exciting as it has been in previous years. This is 3 years now that we've done a series at North Idaho College called Journey Through Time, and our local residents as well as scholars from around the country have come in to do these programs, and we just think it's a great way to understand history. And I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we will move to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.